Paupanakis is a proud Swampy Cree Two Spirit person from the Kinosew Sipi Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory. He has worked in the Indigenous cultural and language revitalization sector for almost 5 years. Other areas of activism he focuses on are Two Spirit resurgence, land and water preservation, and murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two Spirit advocacy. Chance is passionate about working towards a better and brighter future for First Nation peoples.
Katamaskat na wow. Chance Paupanakis Disnigasun Kinosew Sipi Ostanina. Treaty 5 Ostanina Winnipeg Ostanina Mantuape Ostanina. Wigas Disnigasun. What I said was, my name is Chance Paupanakis. I come from the Kinosew Sipi Cree Nation in Treaty 5 territory. I currently live here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm the executive director of the Akingunjay Foundation. We're a rather new charity, and we focus on the preservation and promotion of culture and language, Indigenous cultures and languages. And so it's been really awesome learning opportunity, building the foundation, but also like learning a lot about my own journey with respect to language revitalization. As I said, I come from the Kinosew Sipi Cree Nation, but I've lived in Winnipeg basically my entire life. I go home often. Grew up around my grandmother, my mom's mom, a lot, and as I get older and when I went to school and when I started learning about residential schools and the 60 scoop, day schools, Indian hospitals, there's like a plethora of things that have happened to our people that have caused like a dispossession of our identities. And so as I became educated, I became aware and I wanted to do something about it. And so I started, focusing on my like individual journey of language reclamation. And I'd probably call myself almost intermediate Cree speaker, in that like I can probably have like a basic conversation. I understand probably 65-70% of the language. But yeah, I was thankful, like my mother and father, well, my mother more so speaks Cree fluently, but my dad doesn't. And so that's an interesting story as well, because my dad's parents went to residential school, and so they grew up with the thought that the Cree language wasn't valuable and that the English language was what is needed to succeed in this Western world. And so they didn't teach their kids, including my dad, the language. But however, on the other side of things, my mom, my maternal grandmother, she did not go to residential school, and her dad actually, when the Indian agents would come by plane, and so they would come by plane and they'd take the kids. The RCMP would often help them round up the kids. Obviously, most of the time, if not all the time, it was inconsensual. Like they stole the children, right? And so but what my great grandfather did was he hid my grandmother and her siblings in the bush, in the forest, and so they weren't taken to residential schools. So they grew up speaking their languages, and so too did their children. Like my grandmother and her sisters, all of their kids speak Cree, right? But I'm thankful that my mom, whenever we do speak, I always ask her questions about the language, and same with my grandmothers on both sides. Like all my grandparents speak the language fluently, but my dad doesn't, my mom does. So whenever I speak to my grandmothers especially, I try to learn from them while they're on this earth, because I want to learn Cree, because there's they call it local variation, right? So like you have the Cree Nation, which is like extends from Alberta to Quebec. So it's a really large land. We have a large land base. We're the largest First Nation group in Canada, second in North America, next to the Navajo Nation. And so there's the Y dialect, which is in the west, and then there's the TH dialect, N dialect. I'm N dialect, by the way, which is Swampy Cree. Swampy Cree is mostly in eastern Saskatchewan and northern Manitoba. And so that's where I come from, is the Kinosew Sipi Cree Nation. And language revitalization, I feel, is part of my blood, because Norway House, we kind of lead the way, at least a lot of people from Norway House, although the majority of the community doesn't speak the language because it's a very bottom-heavy community, as most Indigenous communities are, meaning that it's mostly young people in the community. But there's so many people out there who are teaching the language. Like in the Cree culture, we like my grandfather's cousin, Ken Paupanakis, that was the longest serving professor at the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, and he was a Cree professor. And so, but I call him my grandfather, even though like technically he would be like a great uncle almost, right? But yeah, so I feel like it's part of my blood. And when I got this job, you know, I was completely surprised, because it was my first senior directorial role. But it's been amazing. It's been a journey, because being able to give back to people what was stolen from them is invaluable. It's an invaluable award, because language, it really does formulate our worldview, not only as First Nation people, as Cree people, Anishinaabe people, but as human beings. You know, our worldview, the way we view ourselves, the way we view other people and other living beings, is based on our language. And so it's really important that everyone has access to their language. And so when I hear of things like immersion programs in Winnipeg One School Division at Isaac Brock, it makes me really happy that we're moving in that direction of reclaiming our languages and our native tongues. You know, the Kinosew Foundation, as I stated earlier, is rather new. We're small but mighty, I'll say, because, you know, we've been doing a lot of networking, a lot of fun development, partnership building, like with you, Multicultural, and other organizations as such. And so it's been a pleasure, you know, even just to fund. Like, for example, there was an Anishinaabe Moan class that was being taught in Riding Mountain, and they had reached out to us requesting funding for their graduates, and us being a charity, of course, we said yes, because we want to help with the monetary aspect of language revitalization. And so that's a little bit about Kinosew. And as we grow, so too will our mandate. And, you know, eventually my dream for our foundation is that we get to expand into Saskatchewan and Ontario, and then eventually Alberta and Quebec and across the country, really. I have big dreams for our foundation. That's a little bit of what we do. So we offer like workshops, primarily right now because we have a lower human resource capacity. We do a lot of subcontracting. So we contract other organizations. We call them our sister organizations, like the Indigenous Languages of Manitoba, Manitoba Indigenous Cultural Education Center, Manitoba First Nation Education Resource Center, the Manitoba Aboriginal Languages Strategy. And so we help, or they help us deliver our programming. So we give them the money, they deliver the program, and it's a really beautiful partnership. But hopefully in the future, again, as we grow capacity, both human resource capacity and financial capacity, we'll be able to deliver our own programming. That's a short but also long-term goal of mine, if that makes sense. Like, always wanting to grow, because we're in the decade of Indigenous languages right now. The United Nations declared that, I think, in 2019, and so we're seeing a resurgence of reclaiming our languages. I just think it's really beautiful that we're able to be part of that. And I really truly think that, because the way I view things is that Winnipeg, because at the Forks there, that's where the Hudson's Bay Company had their main trading post. And so the Cree people, the Anishinaabe people, Dakota people, Dene people from really all over Turtle Island would meet there and trade. And people argue Well, it's a fact that the Hudson's Bay Company was kind of the first colonial entity in Canada. And so I don't like to think of, but I think of Winnipeg as like the physical epicenter of settler colonialism, because this is where it all began, right? And then it expanded. And so, but again, because of that, we kind of turned our sad story into a success. We turned it around, and now we have so many people in the region working towards Indigenous cultural and language revitalization. Yeah, so in my opinion, I think obviously in Canada, English and French are the official languages of the country, and so most of the funding with respect to languages is allocated towards French and English immersion programs. I grew up speaking English, so I think that's part of it, the governmental kind of interference, but also the unwillingness of the government to allocate funding and resources to our people to reclaim our languages. But I think it's turning around, because our foundation, we received funding from the government of Canada to deliver a Cree language program. But it needs to be on a larger scale. It can't just be these one-time grants. It has to be embedded within the policies, procedures, and practices of not only the federal government, but the provincial government, the municipal government. We just had the renaming of Bishop Grandin Boulevard Street and Trail in Anishinaabemowin, in Animwin, some call it Nahinawewin, and Michif. And so I think that's a small but right step in the right direction with respect to kind of centering Indigenous languages and kind of making newcomers and settlers aware that this is Indigenous land, and before the coming of the European settlers, there were many cultures here, many languages, and it was a thriving, I like to call it a utopia, because we were living off the land, we were living with each other, we were trading with each other, albeit it wasn't perfect. There was war, there was sickness, but at the end of the day, what's the most important is we maintained our sovereignty as First Nation peoples, as Cree, Anishinaabe peoples, Blackfoot peoples, Dene peoples, Dakota peoples. And I argue we still do. It's just that, as we have more people kind of flocking to Canada, it is a beautiful country. But we have more people coming here, so the more people that come here, the harder it is for Indigenous people to be centered in those discussions at the government level. And then also just the public discourse of stereotypes and racism, and the idea that Indigenous peoples can't take care of themselves, that our chiefs and our leadership aren't able to lead our people properly. That's not the truth, I've met many Indigenous leaders, not only chiefs, but leaders of organizations in Canada, Winnipeg, who are leading the way and who are leading our people in a good way. And so I think it's a really nuanced discussion, and it's complex, right? Because it talks about history, law, the Indian Act, which is, I think, we are the only ethnic group in the world that is governed by a federal piece of legislation. And so obviously that is a big hurdle that we need to overcome, is breaking free from the Indian Act. Ovid McCurdy, he's really integral player in Indigenous politics and advocacy in Canada. He was the national chief of the AFN, I believe, and also the chief of Mississippi, otherwise known as Grand Rapids here in Manitoba. But he always says, or I heard him say once, act Indian, not Indian act. And although it was only 5 words, that really resonated with me because it's like, that's so true. We need to start acting like who our ancestors were, because that's what they would have wanted, is for us to be who we were meant to be. And we're very resilient peoples. We've been through so much famine, war, disease, systemic racism, everything. There's a list, and the list seems to continue to grow with missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. But at the end of the day, we're okay, and we're doing the thing. We're reclaiming what was stolen, and we're taking place. We're becoming doctors of Western philosophy, doctors of Western knowledge systems. And so I have a lot of hope. In Cree, hope is Bagasenim win, and I have a lot of hope for our people.
Multicultural is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis.